The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 2. Daniel held young Daniel's hand as they made their way from their home in Jersey Street towards Loom Street. Plenty of folk were up and about, all intent on enjoying the Sunday sunshine. The courts, narrow lanes and streets echoed with the sounds of children's shouts and laughter. Free from labour in the mills, they kicked and threw balls, skipped with ropes and chased each other, as youngsters are prone to do when given half the chance. Mrs. McNamara, one of their neighbours, made a fuss of young Daniel as they passed by. Then she carried on with her task, roundly cursing the porkers whose pigs freely roamed the streets to graze on offal, potato peelings and other rubbish, as she swept pig shit off the dark, narrow streets' broken paving stones. Old men, many Irish hand-loom weavers, and Italian labourers worn out by years of unremitting toil in what they had once thought the promised land, sat on doorsteps, chatting to each other in their native tongues, bemoaning the fact their wives and daughters wouldn't allow them money to go to the local beer house. Irish and Italians outnumbered native English like Daniel in the ancoats of the 1840s. Not that this worried him. Both groups were good neighbours, despite their fair share of villains. No matter how serious their own economic distress, they always helped neighbours in worse straits. The next Irish or Italian woman who rallied to his aid when he required help with young Daniel wouldn't be the first. Father and son walked in the dark shadow of Gibraltar Mill, its red brick walls like the houses crowding round, blackened and filthy with pollution. They crossed the lane dividing it from Nelson Mill. Daniel didn't say anything to his son, but silently cursed Nathaniel West and all his works as he passed the place in the latter mill's shadow where Bessie's blood had stained the cobbles. One day, when the time was right, and the lad old enough to understand, he would take young Daniel into the entrance hall of Gibraltar Mill to show him the plaque commemorating his mother's short life and the role she had played, both as a Chartist and trade unionist. They made their way to Mary's Kitchen. The cooperative enterprise initiated by Irene Rose had been in business for almost 3 years and flourished beyond all expectations. Families sat outside, enjoying their Sunday freedom from wage slavery, some in the shade under the awning, whilst others sat by the wall looking out onto the dark, placid waters of the Rochdale Canal, watching the occasional narrow boat pass by loaded with goods, and delighting in the antics of ducks and drakes. To young Daniel's delight, another of their neighbours, Giuseppe Peduzzi, an Italian youth aged about 17, stood at the regular pitch he'd claimed in the yard, complete with his hurdy-gurdy and his little monkey, resplendent in its red and gold uniform. Cup in hand, little Peppo had been trained to collect coins from Giuseppe's appreciative audience, as well as from those who mistakenly thought, if they paid sufficient, the lad would take his instrument of musical torture elsewhere. Luckily, the latter tended to be in the minority, although Peppo didn't discriminate when performing his duties. Mary Upton appeared at the entrance to the converted barn as the two Daniels approached. "There you be, me little one," she exclaimed in delight, bending down, her arms open wide. Young Daniel let go of his father's hand and sprinted towards her, a big smile splitting his face. He leapt into space fearlessly. Mary caught him under the armpits and spun him around, Daniel giggling for all his worth. His legs flew out, describing a wide arc through the air. Eventually, Mary stopped, fearing she'd fall over with dizziness. She placed the lad on his feet before picking him up once more to hug him close. "Happy birthday, Daniel. How's me favourite little lad?" Daniel laughed, placing his arms around her neck and his soft, warm cheek against hers. "I'm reet gradely, Auntie Mary," he whispered in her ear, sounding all grown up. "Reet gradely? That's an improvement. Last Sunday you were only fair to middling, as I seems to remember." "How art thee, Mary?" Daniel Ackroyd asked. "I can't complain, love." She threaded her left arm through the crook of her friend's right. "Come on, lad, I'm getting a rare treat for the both of you." She took young Daniel's hand in her free hand and coaxed father and son under the awning. "Now," she said, "both of you sit yourselves down. I'll be back afore you knows it." Young Daniel pulled out a chair and clambered onto it. His father slid it gently under the table and sat down next to him, ruffling the lad's hair whilst wondering exactly what Mary's surprise was. At that moment, Irene, Rose, Matthew and Michael entered the barn. No sooner were they sat down than young Daniel was off his seat and climbing onto Irene Rose's knee. Daniel Senior glanced across at the mill owner's daughter. "Lad's been missing you, Miss Rose." Although Irene Rose had been married to Michael for well over 2 years, Daniel, like most of her acquaintances, still addressed her as Miss Rose when they were being formal, and she never asked them to do otherwise. "I've been missing him too," Irene Rose laughed. She hugged the lad tight against her bosom. "Happy birthday, my little one. Are you having a good day?" Daniel looked up into Irene Rose's bright blue eyes and nodded, lost for words for a moment, an unusual occurrence when with the mill owner's daughter. Since his mother's murder, which the child had no memory of, being only 16 months of age at the time, Irene Rose had become a major influence in his life. During the day, Mary Upton looked after Daniel, but Irene Rose usually joined them at some point, and invariably took the lad home with her at 5 most evenings, quite often making an excuse to keep him overnight to give his father a break from childcare. She was teaching the lad to read and write, determined he shouldn't suffer from a lack of education. She wanted him to be well equipped, to take full advantage of the bright future she envisaged for him. Eventually, Mary Upton emerged from the kitchen. She carried 3 bowls full of ice cream, with segments of small oranges perched on top, both a rare delicacy. She placed one in front of each of the 2 Daniels, and then turned to the yard. "Hey, Giuseppe, come over here." The young man broke off his conversation with one of the customers and looked across to Mary. She crooked her finger. "Ice cream, Giuseppe." His face broke into a smile and he hurried across. "You know, young Daniel, Giuseppe, it's the lad's birthday. Sit yourself down and have some ice cream and then play us a tune." "Happy birthday, Dan," the Italian lad grinned. "How are you, Mr. Ackroyd?" "Fine, Giuseppe. How's Rosa?" "Busy, Mr. Ackroyd. She's having another bambino." He shook his head side to side. "One of these days she might have found out what causes 'em," he responded, exaggerating his Ancoats Italian vocabulary. Giuseppe could speak perfect Lancashire with the best of the natives. He grinned a mischievous grin, picked up his spoon, and commenced attacking his ice cream, as though he'd never tasted any. "That looks delicious, Mary. Where on earth have you managed to obtain ice cream?" Irene Rose asked. Mary's face broke into a grin. "It'll be regular on menu from now on, Rose. I've getting a good supplier. One of the Italian women, Rosa Joseph, has asked me to care for one of her children." "Rosa? I had no idea the lass made ices." Daniel sounded somewhat surprised, Rosa being a near neighbour who young Giuseppe lodged with. "Rosa's grandniece of Mary Joseph." Irene Rose nodded, signalling her comprehension. Mary Joseph had founded the Food and Italian Warehouse on Market Street in Manchester's commercial centre over 40 years before. The business had been providing a wide selection of appetising ices in a variety of flavours to the middle classes since the opening of her ice room in 1801. Persuading the company to supply the workers' cooperative represented a genuine coup and a major step forward for Mary Upton and her colleagues. Mary turned to Irene Rose's father and husband. "I've no doubt you want to have a taste, Matthew Edrow, and you too, Michael." "How did you guess, Mary?" Michael asked. "That would be good," Matthew agreed. "Can I help you?" He stood up, not waiting for Mary's reply, and took her by the arm. "I'd like a quiet word," he confided under his breath. "In private, if I may, Mary." Mary, somewhat taken aback, looked up at him. She was about to ask what he wanted, when she noticed the twinkle in his pale blue eyes and something else, a touch of shyness perhaps. She sensed that whatever message or request the mill owner wished to communicate, it wasn't a serious matter, although she guessed it might be a sensitive one. He evidently didn't want to speak to her in front of the others. She laughed. "That's kind of you, Matthew. Come on through to the kitchen." Mary Upton hummed a tune, seemingly in high spirits, as she busied herself replacing cutlery in its drawers, hanging cups on hooks and stacking saucers and plates on shelves. Young Amy Redbank, washing pots in the kitchen, wondered what had sparked the older woman's good humour. Not that Mary was a miserable person, quite the opposite. She tended to be always cheerful, and working with her was a delight. None the less, the 17-year-old sensed something special was going on in Mary's life. She nudged her friend Anna Sutcliffe, busy drying the pots as Amy washed them. "What's got into Mary, do you reckon?" "I reckon Mr. Etherose tickled her fancy," she whispered. "Do you mind if I leave you for a while, Rose?" "Why? Is it something important?" "I thought I might be wandering down to Withy Grove and pay my respects to John Doherty and his family." Irene Rose gazed at her husband for a moment. "Let me guess, Michael. You want to talk to him about Father's revelations earlier." "Now, why would you be making that assumption?" "Because you've hardly said a word for ages, Michael O'Donnell, and you keep frowning, a sure sign you're fretting about something." He shook his head. Irene Rose seemed to know his thoughts before he did himself. "Go on, love, but don't be too late returning. I'll need your help with Daniel's birthday tea later." He leant over and kissed her forehead. "I'll see you later, Rose. I won't be long." He ruffled young Daniel's hair and bade his father-in-law, Daniel Ackroyd, and young Giuseppe goodbye. Rose watched as he left the barn and walked out of the yard. At last she turned to her father. "Are you going to tell me about it, father?" "About what, Rose?" Matthew seemed puzzled by his daughter's sudden and unexpected question. "Your proposal to Mary Upton." A frown creased his brow. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about." "If you don't, perhaps there's some other reason why Mary seems unable to stop humming." She laughed at him, a mischievous look on her face, glanced down at the table for a moment, and then returned her gaze to his eyes. "And I suppose there's quite another reason why you're blushing, father dear. Exactly who do you intend to invite to see the production of Othello at the Theatre Royal, if not Mary Upton?" "It was remiss of me to leave the theatre tickets on the bureau, I suppose," he said, holding his hands up. She leant forward, placing her hand on his. "It's a long time since Mother died, father. I'm pleased you're taking Mary to the theatre. She's a fine woman and good company." "It's not a romance. Nobody can replace Mother." "Of course nobody can replace Mother, but you and Mary need company and friendship. I just wanted you to know I'm pleased for you." Michael threaded his way down Union Street onto Great Ancoat Street. He was soon in Swan Street and down Shudo to Withy Grove and John Doherty's coffee shop and publishing house. The premises were packed and a hubbub of debate, some serious and some not so serious, judging by the laughter. The air had turned a grey blue with tobacco smoke, its acrid scent masking the underlying human odour, the distinctive musky perfume of labouring men's honest sweat. He gazed around and spotted John in the far right-hand corner, in discussion with another of his acquaintances, James Leach. They looked up as he walked towards them. "Now, here's a man who may be able to help you, James," John exclaimed. He stood up to greet his fellow countryman, sticking his hand out. "How are you doing, Michael? Are you knowing me friend James Leach by any chance?" Michael shook his friend's hand. "Aye, James and I are well acquainted. How can I be helping you, my friend?" One of Manchester's leading Chartists, a trade union activist, writer and bookseller, James had worked in coal mines and the cotton industry. Well known for his determination to advance the cause of his class, he was a marked man, blacklisted by colliery, factory and mill owners alike. Compulsory unemployment and its resultant starvation being the manufacturer's off-the-shelf prescription for the disease of insubordination. He shook hands with his friend, and the two men sat down whilst John went to collect fresh coffee. "So what are you up to now, James?" Michael asked. "How can I be of assistance?" Art thou still employed by union, Michael? Aye, I am. I'm working on a new book. I'm collecting facts and figures on impact of new machinery. Michael nodded. Is John planning to publish it? An MP, William Rashley, commissioned it, and has offered to publish at his expense, James informed him. I were inquiring of John if he'd be interested in organising the printing. Have you thought of a title? Aye, it's going to be called Stubborn Facts from the Factories by a Manchester Operative. I'd have thought Facts from the Manchester Factories by a Stubborn Operative might have been more accurate. James' only response was to laugh. John Doughty returned with the coffee. Michael added sugar to his and stirred, preferring it strong, black and sweet. He blew the vapour across the top and took a sip, looking at James as he did so. I haven't exact figures on me, but improvements to machinery are steaming ahead. I know of one mill in Rochdale which has been slowly bringing in double-decker mules. They employed 600 spinners in 1835 and now employ only 300. But the number of spindles the 300 operate is over 10% greater than previously operated by the 600. Furthermore, whereas in 1835 at the same mill 20% were men, they now all women. The same thing's taking place in other sections of the textile industry. He paused, taking another sip of coffee, savouring its rich taste. John obviously had a good supplier. Recent improvements in carding frames tell the same story. One Stockport mill has just put half its carders out of work. In textile printing the story's repeated. 6-colour print machines are replacing 4-colour, and there are rumours of an 8-colour machine under test. Not long ago all printing was by hand, 1 colour at a time. Have you heard of the Jacquard loom? John asked. I can't say I have, Leach replied. It were invented by a Frenchman, Joseph Marie Jacquard, back in 1801. He were a weaver. Lad could neither read nor write till he were 13, but he had a fascination with mathematics and mechanics. He wanted to weave fancy and repetitive patterns on his loom, a very intricate business. Anyway, he put his mind to the problem and modified his loom by making it automatic. Mechanisms controlled by a series of cards with punched holes. The pattern of the holes determines the pattern of the weave. That's another thing, Michael interjected. Automatic spinning mules, what they call self-actors, are under development. Once they're set going, they do the job on their own. James Hargreaves has a lot to answer for, John Doughty observed. Pity the Luddites weren't successful and stopped the problem of mechanisation in its tracks before it had real chance to gain momentum. James Leach laughed. It's no use blaming poor Hargreaves, that's history. Besides, his motivation were honourable. Aye, you're right, Michael agreed. They say necessity is the mother of invention. How do you mean? John Doughty asked. Back in the 18th century, handloom weavers didn't have a problem with overproduction. They had difficulty keeping up with demand. The weavers relied on the family to card and spin the wool. It was a handicraft business carried out at home. It took 3 spinners to produce the yarn for one weaver. But the spinners, usually the weavers' wives and daughters, had other household duties. They couldn't afford to be sat at their spinning wheels all day. Hargreaves solved the problem in 1764, when he invented the spinning jenny. It enabled his wife to spin 16 bobbins for every one she produced before. That were how it started. You're right, Michael, James Leach agreed. Where did Arkwright come into this? John Doughty asked. I thought he invented the jenny. Michael shook his head. No, he's credited with inventing the spinning frame. From what I understand, Arkwright was a charlatan, although he became a rich man and lauded by many as the father of the Industrial Revolution. Apprenticed to a barber in Kirkham near Preston, he met a clockmaker called Kay. He gave him the design for a spinning frame, which Arkwright patented, and they went into partnership. Trouble was, the real inventor of the spinning frame, Thomas Hayes, had asked Kay to manufacture it in metal for him. Hayes, a reed maker, hailed from Lee. When taken to court, the patents were taken off Arkwright, But by then he'd made a fortune, and it didn't prevent him being knighted. Don't be too hard on Arkwright, James said. He had some principles. 3/4 of the workers in his Manchester mill were children, and he wouldn't take 'em on until their 6th birthday. John Doherty listened to this information with some surprise. Richard Arkwright's reputation obviously didn't quite match the reality, assuming Michael and James were correct. However, by now his fellow Irishman was in full flow, and John saw no reason to challenge either of his friend's veracity. Whatever Arkwright's role, once water power and subsequently steam power were applied to these machines, the Industrial Revolution was really underway. Another Lancashire man, Samuel Crompton from Bolton, developed a spinning mule in 1785, and in the same year a country parson, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, developed the first power loom, although it took until 1801 before it was capable of competing with a hand loom weaver. From that moment on, the hand loom weavers were doomed. Hargreaves set out to make his own, and as a consequence all weavers' lives easier, and ended up ensuring their impoverishment. At the height of their powers, an independent hand loom weaver and his family could earn up to £4 sterling a week. Nowadays, a hand loom weaver's lucky to earn 10 shillings. He looked his companions in the eye. We can't turn back the clock. These inventions made by simple, practical men with few resources for the best of reasons led to modern industry, and the dire situation workers find themselves in today. James Hargreaves and the rest didn't envisage, let alone understand, the powerful anarchic forces they were unleashing on society. Innovations across all industries will follow as sure as night follows day. Weavers and spinners, wherever our cottons penetrate, will be impoverished in their turn. Capital respects no national boundaries, and modern working men have no country. Whether we're Irish, English, French, German or Indian, the same enemy grinds us down. James Leach smiled. I must admit I'm reet glad these 2 Irish troublemakers are on my side. I'd hate to have you agin me. The question all labouring people need to ask isn't whether further improvements in machinery will take place, but who'll control that machinery's use, Michael pointed out. Machines used and controlled for the common good offer us the possibility of cheaper products, the benefits of leisure time, the possibility of acquiring education and knowledge. All could enjoy improved living standards and a pleasant life. On the other hand, the status quo, private ownership and control, only holds out further wage cuts, degradation, poverty and starvation for the overwhelming majority. Aye, you're right, Michael, John Doherty agreed. Machines are neutral, they're not the cause of social injustice any more than God is. Those afflictions are man-made. Machines have the capacity to help us make a better world. Who controls the machine is key. Even the forces of Ned Ludd, a much malign lot if ever there was one, knew that, and that's why we must have the Charter. Aye, the Meisters aren't good at rewriting history, James intervened. The Luddites were ne'er again machinery, even though they were experts at breaking it. They were again the replacement of time-served workers by unskilled and untrained labour as machine-minders. That were the point of their campaign. I'm with Owen. 6 points to the Charter, nobbut the means to an end for working folk. What us really need is cooperation and a new society. Young Daniels warmed me out, Michael. The lad enjoyed himself, Rose. Yes, I think he did, and I'm taking him out tomorrow. I'm going to have him all to myself. We're going out in the Pony and Trap for a picnic. I'll take Clara and Charlotte's children with me. Daniel and little Emma are almost inseparable. That's a bit of a handful. I'll take Grace. She's good with the children, and she'll enjoy it. It will be good for her to get out of the house. She smiled to herself. You never told me how your discussion with John Doherty went. It went very well, but not as I expected. Irene Rose glanced up from her embroidery, interested to know why this was the case. We never discussed your father's thoughts, he explained. James Leach was in the coffee-house. He's been commissioned to write a new book. We were discussing the impact of new machinery. By the time we'd finished, it was time for me to go. Ah, well, I suppose we've plenty of time before we need to organise for next autumn, she stated quietly. She rose from her seat and walked over to her husband. He looked at her for a moment, his deep blue eyes shining and his thick dark eyebrows raised. Irene Rose had a certain look in her eye, and she seemed different of late. He wondered if spending so much time with young Daniel had made her broody. "Come on, it's time to put the cares of today to one side for now," she stated. "They can wait until tomorrow. We've more important things to occupy our minds. Take me to bed. Explain to me why you love me so much, and I'll return the compliment." Michael laughed and took her outstretched hand in his.